Hello and welcome to the webinar of National Child Protection Week. Today we are very privileged to have Michelle Murray and Professor Pam Snow with us to have a conversation around every child and every community needs a fair go, and communities, families need all the tools that we can provide to make sure that young people thrive. My name's Dale Murray. I'm the Director of Education for Life Without Barriers. And just as we begin, can I acknowledge we are all sitting on lands that have never been ceded in this country, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. And it always was, always will be First Nations country. As I mentioned, this is a part of a series of webinars that Life Without Barriers has been holding this week. And some of you, I hope, have had the opportunity to join in on the webinar that was earlier this week on learning through a cultural lens with our First Nations leads, which gave a really great overview and great conversation around the importance of thinking about learning from a First Nations perspective and learning and knowledges in the way First Nations people have and continue to share and knowledge and ways of learning that is grounded in country and culture. Yesterday's First Nation and yesterday's webinar around family involvement talked about some of the complexities we all face with children and young people engaging in school, and I think it was Glenn that said, you know, at the end of it, if we don't do this, who does this work in supporting young people to maintain connection to schools, and bigger than that, about the importance of how we ensure that young people's literacy development, educational development, and general learning is enhanced, and young people can meet their potential. Yeah, so. This is going to be a really fantastic conversation because both Michelle and I have had the pleasure of listening and working with Pam for many years. Pam is the Professor of Cognitive Psychology at School of Education at La Trobe University in Bendigo. She and Michelle are both speech language pathologists, so I am completely outranked here at the moment in terms of that. I'm just like a poor, humble English teacher that could barely spell. So Pam's going to be shocked when I say that out loud.
Nothing shocks me.
Thanks, Pam. And Pam's interests concern, language literacy skills for vulnerable children, adolescents. And I would encourage you at some point, if you are really interested in this work, to look at the work Pam has done over many years. She is one of Australia's leading experts in this space. So we're very fortunate. Really lovely to have you, Pam. And Michelle has also done work in this space for over 25, 30 years now, supporting children and young people in out-of-home care and in really remote and kids that have been really disenfranchised from school from a speechy perspective, and also in establishing a lot of schools across the country with myself. So we've got, between us, I think I added up, we've got about 450 years of experience in this world. So on that very challenging note, we might, if it's okay, Pam, ask you to do a bit of a presentation and set a bit of a scene around the importance of making sure that young people and children can reach their potential in terms of language and literacy. And they kind of will wind out of this after your presentation into some of the stuff that we've been trying to do with our Hook into Books program. Yeah?
Sounds good to me.
So over to you, Pam. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dale. And good morning, everyone. Thank you to Dale and Michelle for the opportunity to take part in this webinar and this important work in this important week in the calendar in the child protection space. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands that we're all meeting on. In my case, it's the Dja Dja Wurrung and Talgorong peoples in Bendigo in central Victoria, and acknowledge, as Dale did, that this always has been and always will be Aboriginal land. And I'd like to extend a particular welcome to any First Nations peoples joining us here today. So let me give you a bit of an overview of the space that I'm going to try and cover quite quickly this morning. I'm going to talk to you a bit about what language is. As Dale said, Michelle and I are both speech pathologists, so we have a particular lens on this concept of language. We'll look at how language development is influenced by early environment and experiences, why all of this is important. I'll share a little taste of some of our findings on the language skills of vulnerable adolescents. I'll link that to language and behaviour and academic success. And unfortunately, this thing that you're probably familiar with, if not by name, by nature, the school to prison pipeline, and then have a think about what we can all do to try and minimise the vulnerability in line with the theme of this week, a fair go for all young children, young people, regardless of their circumstances and their starting point. Now, this is a model that I published in a paper last year. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it now, but I'm very happy to share the paper with Dale and Michelle so it can go up on the website. It's an open access paper. So the idea here is that in building strong young people, we're building metaphorically a house. And this house, like all houses, has to have solid foundations. But like all houses too, we've got to think about the kind of ground that we're putting the house on. So in this case, we want the solid ground to be those really strong, attuned, emotional responses of carers, particularly in the first 2 years of life. We want secure attachment. We want serve and return interactions. We want the development of empathy, all of those things that set us up well for the whole lifespan, not just for infancy and childhood. What happens in the first 2 years of life casts a very long shadow, for better or for worse, across the whole lifespan. The foundations of the house in this model are a big slab of granite that represents the early oral language experiences that children have in the first 5 years of life. Expressively, they're talking and receptively what they're taking in. Then the walls of the house, on one side, we've got that ongoing development of oral language skills so that we can form and maintain relationships and transact the business of everyday life using our verbal skills. And on the left-hand side, we've got the transition to reading, writing, and spelling, and that has to happen at school. So the important distinction here is that what's happening on the right-hand side of this house is what's biologically natural. It's what we humans have evolved to do. It's not set and forget, but we do have a strong evolutionary advantage. So oral language is biologically primary. Reading, writing, and spelling, however, are biologically secondary, and we need to go to school, and ideally we need to get really good instructional experiences when we're at school. And we know, unfortunately, that a lot of young people who are in the care system haven't had those kind of experiences, and so their literacy skills are very patchy. Now, we want to, of course, put a roof on the house, but before we put the roof on, we're going to put a strong structural beam in place, which is all about social, emotional, and behavioural well-being and social cognition skills, the ability to read the play in real time in social situations. These are skills that are valued very strongly by employers. They're sometimes referred to as soft skills, which I think is an unfortunate misnomer because there's nothing soft about them, and they're actually very hard to teach, and they're hard to backfill for young people who don't have strong social cognition skills. So they need to be developing all the way through childhood and adolescence with lots of support from adults in the child's world. Then we can think about the roof on the house, which of course is importantly keeping young people connected to education, keeping them achieving academically and feeling good about being at school, and being able to transition to some kind of further training, ongoing education, so that they exit all of this with marketable employment skills and can be part of the social and economic mainstream. Bear in mind, we've got a very industrialised first world economy that we live in, where jobs for unskilled workers are disappearing. The march of artificial intelligence into the workforce is such that the unskilled jobs at the lower end, if you like, of the workforce are just already disappearing, and they're not going to be there in future years. So we cannot afford to have 15-year-olds exiting school with low literacy and low numeracy skills, because there just aren't going to be those employment opportunities for them to be part of the social and economic mainstream. Best example I can give you very quickly is of the self-checkout points in your local supermarket. If you think about how what the transformations that creates in that little microcosm of a workforce. So what do we mean when we say oral language? Well, what I'm talking about here is everyday talking, expressive skills, what I'm doing at the moment, everyday listening, receptive comprehension skills, what you're doing. Excuse me, and of course the mental representations, the thought processes that sit behind them. So language isn't just words coming out of our mouths. Language is a carriage system for something conceptual. It's a carriage system for the cognitive processes, the ideas, the memories, the thoughts, the beliefs, the wishes, the plans that we have inside our head, and language gets those out to the world, either through the spoken word, through the written word, or through gesture and sign. Now, it is a bit of a messy business, language, because it belongs to us as humans. And we often acknowledge that written language is messy in English, complicated. We don't always readily acknowledge just how complicated spoken language is. And it's particularly complicated for people who have any kind of developmental challenges. And of course, people who are learning English as a second language find it a particularly opaque language to get mastery of. Developmentally, language starts with crying in infancy, and really it's quite extraordinary what happens in the first 5 years of life. It is absolutely amazing that we take an infant who can only cry to indicate a biological state. And then typically by the time children get to 5 years old and they're off to school, they're telling long, elaborate stories about things that they did on the weekend. They're talking about things that are not in the here and now. So in early infancy and toddlerhood, it's all about the here and now. By the time they're 5, they're talking about things that happened last week, the week before. They're talking about things that are going to happen in the future. So it's really quite extraordinary, the achievements that most children manage to make. And that's because of the fact that, as I said earlier, oral language is our biologically natural drive as humans. It's what we've evolved to do as humans. We have a language brain. We don't, however, have a reading brain, and this is really critical. We can acquire a reading brain through the kinds of instruction that we receive at school, and we know from MRI research, brain imaging research, for example, on adults who are illiterate, that the neural mechanisms and pathways in their brains are different from the pathways in the brains of adults who are literate. And that's because reading instruction teaches the brain, in particular the left hemisphere of the brain, how to adapt to reading. So that's a contrivance, if you like. Reading and writing and spelling are contrivances, but we get to do all this somewhat seamlessly in the first 5 years of life because of our evolutionary advantage for language. Language consists of many different component parts, and I don't have time to drill down on these today, but just to give you a sense of the kind of frameworks that speech pathologists think about. We think about the form of language, so that's the sound systems that we use in a particular language, the rules of syntax, how we put words together, and morphology refers to the small components of meaning within words. Then we've got the content part, which is mainly vocabulary and how we express meaning. And we've got some particular challenges in English because we have probably the largest vocabulary in the world. Of all the world's languages, English is the biggest, which is wonderful for those of us who manage to become strong language users. It is extra challenging for young people who are not strong language users because the hill is longer and steeper to climb. The view's better from the top for us in English, but it's much harder to get to the top of that vocabulary hill. And that's because of the history of English and the way we've taken words in from so many other languages. Then there's the use part of language, which is putting it all together and responding appropriately in social contexts in everyday life. That goes back to that structural beam in the language house and that social cognition and the ability to read the play. So it's not enough to use sentences that work together grammatically and be using the right words if you're not reading the play and understanding that other people don't want to keep talking about this topic, or that you're talking too much, or that you're just not picking up on subtle social cues in social interactions. Now, we know that language development is very strongly connected to early mental health. And if you think back to the language house, that's really the solid ground that we want to build our house on. So we know that things that promote early mental health also promote early language development. We know that it's very helpful for children to be responded to reliably and promptly by adults who are warm and attuned, who use soothing tone of voice and language, who use what's been referred to as motherese or parentese, what we might call baby talk. If you're wondering, yes, baby talk is what we should be using with babies. That's a conversation for another day. But linking emotional states with words, that's the beginnings of emotional self-regulation. When you're given a word, a label for how you're feeling, that helps all of us. It helps us as adults when we can find a word for how we're feeling. It also helps us, of course, sow the seeds of empathy, because if we understand the verbal label for how we're feeling, angry, hurt, upset, happy, sad, whatever, then when we see that emotional response in another person, we're more likely to be able to respond in an empathic and attuned way. And of course, all of that leads to social cognition over time. Now, all of that's fine, all of that structural stuff about language, but in everyday interactions, we actually use language in ways that are not literal. So we make our interactions, our conversations with each other more interesting and more engaging by playing with language. Now, again, I'm not going to spend time going through these examples, but we use these a lot. And we make a lot of use of language where there's a distance between our intended meaning and our spoken meaning, and it's the listener's job to do the heavy lifting and work out what we actually mean. So if I said, gee, it's been fabulous being in lockdown for the last umpteen dozen weeks, you would be pretty sure in predicting that I'm being sarcastic, because it really hasn't been fabulous being in lockdown. But that's your job to work that out. Now, this all works reasonably well most of the time in face-to-face interactions. But of course, once children start to become independent readers, they're exposed to literary devices that are often unique to the text that they're reading. The mark of a strong author, in fact, is their ability to come up with their own clever use of language that we as readers have never encountered before. So having strong mastery of these kind of devices in the spoken interpersonal space helps to set students up to deal with those metaphorical devices that they have to draw inferences from in reading. So we know developmentally language skills keep company with a whole raft of other skills that promote academic success and they promote social success. So if you think back to the language house, all of these skills are relevant to the walls on both sides of the house, and hopefully the kinds of experiences that children are having at home and at school under ideal circumstances, helping to wrap language around each of these processes. Social cognition, I've already talked about that. The important thing here with social cognition is that we humans are socialized to play against our emotions. So we're socialized to say we're happy when we're not happy. But it's really helpful if we're able to read the cues in real time and figure out that a person means something different from what they're actually saying. And that goes back to that idea of those soft skills that employers are so fond of, and we all like it when the people that we work with and live with have high quality soft skills as well and can read the play. And that's closely related to the kinds of language skills and language experiences that people have in that children have in the early years. Now, one of the things we do know about early language development is that socioeconomic status is important, and that there is a social gradient, unfortunately, that children sit on. And unfortunately, as you know, children in the child protection system, there's an overrepresentation of children from more disadvantaged families and communities. So they are going to come into school with less well-developed oral language vocabularies because they've had less rich exposure. Even though oral language development is natural, it's not set and forget. So the kind of experiences that children have are important. And what this means is that schools need to be ready to actually accelerate the progress of children who are starting from behind. We don't get to throw our hands up in despair and say, oh, well, what can we do? What we have to do is make every instructional hour, every instructional minute count when children get to school. So we've got to hold these two competing ideas in mind in relation to language. It's biologically natural, but it's also very delicate. And you can see things on this slide that will potentially disrupt language, whether they be inherent neurobiological disorders or environmental experiences. It doesn't take much to nudge language developmentally and make it vulnerable. Language is obviously strongly connected to culture. And again, that's a topic that I don't have time to do justice to today, but I just want to acknowledge the role of culture, and in particular, of course, the role of culture for our First Nations children, because there are certain aspects of, for example, non-verbal behaviour that are sometimes quite different in Indigenous cultures from what they are in, if you like, mainstream white Caucasian cultures. So we need to just remember that not everything that we see is necessarily an indicator of a disorder. It may be quite culturally appropriate in other contexts. We also know that there's a two-way relationship between language skills and reading problems. So some children who are fortunate in the preschool years to have their language difficulties identified, and unfortunately, many children don't have their language difficulties identified in the preschool years, but those children are likely to go on and develop and display difficulties learning how to read. But there's a larger group of children who have language problems when they start school that are not identified, and we become aware of them when they have trouble learning how to read. So these two things are very closely connected, and sometimes it's hard to know what's the chicken and what's the egg in terms of where the problems have started and the point in time at which the problems are identified. But we do know that we need to have these children very strongly on our radar. If we've got any concerns about their language skills, then we have to be concerned about their reading potential, because remember, that's not biologically natural. The children are going to need high quality instruction to get there. Okay, so I've been talking about language, and now I'm going to get you to do something. So if you've been multitasking while you've been listening, that's fine, but put your other devices down and have a listen. I'm going to get you to follow an instruction, and it's important that you do it correctly. Okay. I want you to pick up your phylodactyphone and place it periplantally along the hyperspondyle aspect of your dipaxon. Okay, jump to it. Come on. Dale, Michelle, can't see you doing it. Now, welcome to the world of a child with a language disorder. Or even weak language skills, or the EAL child who doesn't have sufficient English language skills in order to be able to keep up with the play in the classroom. I bet every single one of you did pay attention and did intend to follow that instruction, but suddenly it was, I've got to do something about something and what, and you can see how things start to fall apart in classrooms for kids with weak language skills, because all of a sudden they're looking at the kid next to them and hoping that they know what to do, and the teacher's thinking they're off task, and things can go from bad to worse. Now, Dale, tell me how long I can talk for, because I can cut the cloth accordingly.
I'll just consult with my timekeeper.
Yep.
About another 5 or 7 minutes or so.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay.
Fantastic.
So what does all this have to do with vulnerable young people? Well, hopefully you're starting to answer that question in your mind. We know that there's a big literature on so-called ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. These are not the kind of ACEs that you want to be holding in the card game of life. The kind of adverse childhood experiences that are overrepresented in the lives of children in the child protection system all have a negative impact on the development of language, and anything that impacts negatively on language has significant consequences for literacy. So whenever we're thinking language, we're also thinking literacy. Now, we know that there's a particular pathway to out-of-home care and or youth justice, and you know that all of the factors that you can see represented on this slide are overrepresented in the backgrounds of young people in those two systems. And in many cases, of course, they're one and the same group of young people. It's kind of same factory, different doors that they're entering through on different days. And unfortunately, what the grown-ups often notice most is the behaviour and conduct difficulties, but we don't always peel the onion and find the underlying language difficulties. But we can look at that same set of risk factors now through the lens of language development, and guess what? They form a perfect storm for language and later literacy development as well. So the factors that promote the likelihood of young people being in the youth justice system in particular are also the factors that promote the likelihood of them having weak language and literacy skills and disengaging early from school, or being disengaged early from school. So when we look at our research that we've done over the last 20 years or so on young people in the youth justice system in Australia, what we can say with a pretty high level of confidence is that around 50 to 60% of young males have got a clinically significant yet previously undiagnosed language disorder that can't be explained on the basis of IQ, disability, mental health problems. That doesn't mean that all of those things are not overrepresented in the youth justice system. They are, but they're not the explanatory factor for the high rates of language disorder. We found links between language disorder and past history of interpersonal violence, language disorder and coming into youth justice via child protection, higher rates of language disorder in young people from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander backgrounds, even when we control very carefully for exposure to standard Australian English, and higher rates of language disorder in young female offenders, not as high as in young males, but higher than in the community. Now, this is just give you a quick taste of some research that we did in flexible education settings. 52% of this sample performed below average on a standard measure of language skills. In adolescents in out-of-home care, on the same measure, 91.5% performed below the average level on that same measure. I'm not going to go through this slide. I will give you copies of the slides. That's just some examples of the sort of responses that we see when we ask a young person to define words. And when you get the slides, have a look at them and you'll appreciate, I think, just how thin the language skills are of these young people. These are just some examples of the kinds of common idioms that these young people have a lot of trouble understanding. Remember, I said a moment ago that we carry out the business of everyday life using a lot of non-literal language, and you might not even think of these as being non-literal. They're so pervasive and so common in the way that we talk to each other, but they're not necessarily expressions that all young people can understand. The take-home message for me is that language problems are very, very common, but they're also invisible, and they masquerade as a raft of other behaviours, and they earn young people a raft of other labels that can compound their difficulties and their sense of disengagement from systems and services that are really there to try and help them and to try and help build that language house that's going to give them access to the social and economic mainstream. We know that boys who've got behaviour problems and learning difficulties, by which I mean problems learning how to read, write and spell, should always raise particular red flags for us, and we should always have a close look at their language skills, because that may well be the factor that's contributing to both their behaviour problems. Behaviour occurs in the interpersonal space, after all, which is where we're meant to be using language, and reading is reliant on language as well. So we need to remember that behaviour is communication. Behaviour problems are serious mental health problems. Often children and young people are communicating a skill deficit to us when they're through their behaviour, but they're not saying, I have a skill deficit. They're telling us that through their behaviour. So this, of course, means that we need to think about this phenomenon of the school to prison pipeline. And importantly, in my head, this is not just about physical prisons, because I think of social exclusion as being the more catastrophic and chronic long-term form of imprisonment. Having a period of detention is awful, but it's not the same as being on the margins right across your lifespan. So we need to remember that that's what we're trying to prevent. And guess what? Having strong literacy skills is one of the best ways that we can prevent young people from entering the school to prison pipeline. So there's some tips on how we can close the school to prison pipeline. Again, I won't go through those in dot by dot detail. They all emphasise the importance of high quality instruction. Young people being engaged is not enough. The easiest thing to do is to make people look busy. We can, make a classroom of 35-year-olds look busy and engaged. Are they learning anything? Not necessarily. So this comes back, of course, to avoiding the soft bigotry of low expectations, or worse still, the soft bigotry of no expectations. Couple of slides on what you can do when you're working with these young people, and probably the most important point here is the first one, that vulnerable, difficult, tetchy 15-year-old sitting in front of you might actually be more like a 5-year-old linguistically, in terms of the really complex things that I've only touched on very briefly today. Language is a very complex, higher order process, and it's hard to be good at it. So there are some things that you can do across these two slides to try and promote the likelihood of communication success and access to that young person in a therapeutic sense and in an educational sense. We skilled communicators have got a communication dial that looks a bit like this. We can make fine graduated differences in how we communicate according to our read of the play in real time. These young people that we're talking about and that we've done our research on have communication dials that look a bit like this. They're much more blunt instruments. And what we're trying to do, I guess, through our work in this space is to give these young people communication dials that allow more finely graduated responses so that they can succeed in the interpersonal space and get that roof on their language house. Okay, I'm going to stop. The next few slides are some open access papers that talk about some of our research, and that's how you can make contact with me.
Pam, thank you very much. And as usual, an amazing amount of information and so well put. I remember the first time I saw the language house and was just struck with, the metaphor of that and the actual the absolute essential part of the first few years of life, or the first 1,000 days, and then thinking about like that amazing transformation that happens in that first 5 years, from crying to right through to constructing futures and sentences and understanding past, and what how incredibly amazing that is. It just constantly kind of strikes me as brilliant. Staying with the maintenance of the language house, and that sort of idea is, and it's to both you and Michelle, this question: what are some of the strategies that we can support carers and our workforce with that are listening to this conversation now, when they go into schools and they're facing a school that might be saying, look, the behaviour this young person's presenting in your care is, we're done, we're out of this, that we're going to suspend again, et cetera, and they're often kind of threatening places a bit. And one of the things we're really trying to do is put across the message that schools are really a place of a public service. They shouldn't be threatening, they should be welcoming and opening, and maintenance of those relationships is, really, really important. And people in schools are like us, mums and dads that have got kids and all of that. So trying to park the threat of going into school for adults and walk into those places armed with a bit of thinking about the language house and how schools can start to rethink and understand more deeply that behaviour is communication. And there's some of that stuff you pointed to. I'm really interested in having you both speak about things that you've seen that work for caseworkers and pracs and carers in that space.
Michelle's probably got more on the ground experience on this one than I have. I think just quickly, it helps if there is someone in the school who is prepared to listen and think differently about the young person. I do think it's problematic in many schools that people have given up academically on these young people. And, I think really holding on to that idea of high expectations of and for every young person. Some schools with good intentions favour engagement over academic actual learning. And there's good longitudinal research now that tells us when we've got kids, say by the middle primary school years, who've got reading problems and behaviour problems, the reading problems typically precede the behaviour problems. Yeah. So if we get reading right early on, guess what? We've got even kids who are potentially going to be tricky and challenging. We've got them on task and succeeding because they know what to do. They're not having to feel overly activated and stressed and hyper aroused every time they're asked to do something that they can't do, because they can do it. And sometimes schools and teachers and principals are a bit alarmed when I say that the cognitive psychology research tells us that we should be successfully teaching 95% of children to read. 95%. So there should only be 5% of children who have got some underlying neurobiological disorder that need extra support. But, in reality, it varies from community to community, of course, but, 30-40% is not unrealistic. And that's back on us. That's on the adults. It's not on the kids. So I think some hard conversations about the rigour of reading instruction is important. But as I said, Michelle's got more on the ground experience.
Thanks, Pam. I loved all of your answers, and one of the things I wouldn't mind going back to, because it came up in the conversation yesterday, and Dale touched on it as well, is just how difficult it can be for people to walk into the schools to have that conversation with the schools, that they can just be such overwhelming places for people. And, if you've had a negative experience of school, or even if that, and this comes from personal experience where, the first few years of my one of my children's lives, he was an absolute nightmare in the school. And, there were some days where I would run into the school, pick him up as fast as I could and run out of the school gates before anybody had a chance to talk to me, because, I just didn't have the strength for that conversation that day around his behaviour. So, I know how daunting they can be, but to really just emphasise that the best thing we can do is to walk into the school and not do what I did on those days, is to run out of the school. but and it is really okay to dig in. It is really okay when you think the strategy isn't working, and if you know that a suspension or a reduced enrolment, that strategy that we seem to fall back on, and that can go on for way too long. We know that sometimes a young person finishing a little bit earlier to transition them into school, or to because they have worn out because something particular is going on for them for a very short period of time. If it's in the young person's interest, maybe okay, but we've all seen that this is a strategy that the system has used because the school will say, well, we don't have enough teacher aid time to keep supporting that young person for a full day of school, and that's it's okay to push back on that, because actually that's a system problem.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Putting on the young person, right?
Exactly. And I'm, very mindful and respectful of the fact that schools are stretched and under-resourced, but we're not going to find solutions unless we're all pushing in the same direction and recognising that the more time that goes by, the harder and harder it becomes to make up for lost time, and the less likely it becomes that we will make up for lost time, and the more baked on the emotional and behavioural complications become. And so then these young people become, labelled as, behaviour problems, and that is a risk of substance abuse issues, mental health issues. Behaviour problems are mental health problems. I'm always at pains to emphasise that. But we don't have service delivery systems that can cater properly to huge numbers of young people with very complex needs. Prevention's always better than intervention. And we don't always join the dots, I don't think, between academic success in the first 3 years of life and preventing psychosocial sequelae from being a weak reader. Reading matters enormously. We attach a huge cultural, social and economic significance to reading, and we have to get it right. And I think that's an area that we need to have a big national conversation about, actually.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Again, I think that often when we're meeting with schools, because, when we are having complex meetings with schools, it is often around a young person's behaviour, and we do know that a lot of the behaviours do come from a trauma perspective, and that we need to acknowledge that, and that we need to find ways of supporting the classroom teacher and the young person and everybody around that. But it's only going to happen by all of us working together. And and how do we kind of create that relationship between the school, the family, the young person, the carer, the care agency that's supporting the carers. Like, how do we make sure that that's a really strong relationship where, and I think sometimes it's just asking the simple question. It's a little bit what, Dale talked about before. Well, if not us, then who? Like if we don't, we're the adults in the room, like if, we need to work out how we can make this work better for this child, because it is so critical, not just for how they are today and next week, but actually for how they are, in their long-term futures. So
absolutely,
yeah. You right?
Yeah, I'm just switching it on. You might have to mute yours. We're in the same room, so we're muting. There's just a question or a comment come up in the chat. I'll just read to you. I remember of the. I'm reminded of the protective factors that promote development from the CARE model. So CARE is a practice framework we use right across Life Without Barriers, which is an excellent framework that sort of all our staff are offered support in. And so these protective factors are like the high expectation messages, caring relationships and opportunities for participation and contribution. So really being advocate for young people in learning around those care principles is a really important part of the organisation's work. And it's, I think, so if you think about those sort of frameworks we have across our the organisation and linking it to part of what we're trying to do in the education unit is to bring education, or this idea of learning, front of mind for everyone, to shift and then to help people have those sort of conversations, that is with schools and other agencies, whereby that behaviour is attached, is the communication, and those sorts of behaviours we often see that get people, tragically managed enrolment, an hour a day, these sorts of things, suspended, excluded. I mean, all of those kinds of strategies that schools put in place where they run out of ideas, all they further do is further traumatise and further disenfranchise young people, from the experience of actually healing and being able to thrive and trying to have.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I actually have a slide that I didn't use today that's headed tongue-in-cheek, how to create a school-to-prison pipeline. It's the recipe, if for some perverse reason you wanted to create a school-to-prison pipeline, these are the things that you should do. And unfortunately, you've just been talking about many of the things that are in that recipe, inadvertently, of course, and schools get driven to short-termism in their thinking, and they need to be safe workplaces and learning spaces and so forth, but there still is that responsibility to all learners. And when we're looking at children who are strongly impacted by trauma, we need to adapt the environment to be able to make learning possible for those children.
Oh, absolutely. And again, if not us, who? So it comes back to having that sense of a deep sense of advocacy, and it's a fundamental right for
absolutely,
all children and young people to access school. And unfortunately, what we see more, far too much overrepresentation of, is children of out-of-home care or in connection with child protection that are on managed enrolment, suspended, or And the other issue that kind of takes me back to because I love your metaphor of the house, takes me back to the top of the roof. So many children and young people in out-of-home care not completing year 12.
So,
the issue of those 21st century or soft skills, I think we've been calling them 21st century skills kind of thing. Those young people not having those skills, falling out of the systems in sort of halfway through grade 10, a bit of grade 11, and then we see it on the stats. We see that there's just not enough young people in child protection finishing year 12. Then you are essentially, as you rightly pointed out, and then more so now, condemned to a future that is disenfranchised.
Absolutely.
Because the work's simply not going to be there. And if you look at anything from the Foundation for Young Australians, that report they did a few years ago on the future of work, and it's happening. Your supermarket analogy is perfect. It's happening. It's around us.
Absolutely. And if anyone can think back to the day when we used to be able to get on aeroplanes and leave the country, there was a time when we went through. Forgotten. Was a time when we went through immigration that it was a person who looked at our face and looked at our passport. So that was a kind of a semi-skilled job. You didn't have to go to university to do that job. You could be trained up in the workplace. But now it's artificial intelligence. We look at a camera, it assesses the biometric data from our face. It compares that with the biometric data in our passport. So think of the people who get to develop that computer software and hardware. They're the people who did make the transition to literacy and succeeded academically and stayed at school and went to university, versus other people who perhaps weren't so fortunate but could still be part of the social and economic mainstream because they could be trained up to do those previous roles when they existed. But artificial intelligence is already here in our workplace. We perhaps just haven't properly registered the impact that it's going to have on the unskilled workforce.
Indeed. And one of the strategies that we've developed and am implementing as we speak across Life Without Barriers is our Hook into Books program, which is really kind of a fun way, we hope, of helping carers and our workforce engage with books and literacy. And we've had a whole range of authors come on board and do little vlogs for us. We've got travelling suitcases full of books going out to any office that's open or family or that wants to put their hand up for that. We've had Ursula Dubikalski, the laureate this year, do some work with us on trying to get each young person in out-of-home care registered in a library. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I've just noticed they've put up in the chat the link to Hook into Books if people can go and have a look at
good.
that. We're doing some online reading with Life Without Barriers staff have formed reading teams, and that'll be happening across the school holidays. So carers can sign in to their kids to sign in for half an hour reading. And we've got a whole bunch of people doing that. So that program we're going to continually run successive years and hopefully expand that a bit to other care providers so that we start to really lift this idea that, you know, literacy is essential, not just for the fun of it, but for health, well-being, thriving. And so that's rolling. We're also starting to delve in a bit more into looking at trying to identify those young people in year 3 from their NAP plan results where there might be some gaps. So we're starting to develop those kinds of things. We've got a few minutes left. Michelle, would you like to make some comment on
don't ask me, because I've got my own comments in my head, and I don't want you to throw me with some other questions that'll take me down another rabbit hole because we've got really short on time. I just wanted to comment just on a couple of things that, you know, I think sometimes we can get also a little bit overwhelmed with the enormity of it. Do you know what I mean? Like it feels like that it's insurmountable, that there's so much to overcome. And I just want to put a shout out to, you know, going back to some of that fundamentals that, you know, a young person has to feel connected to someone at school. You know, they have to feel like someone's got their back, you know, and that relationship, you know, which again is one of the strong care principles, is so critical, you know, as the start point, you know, for a young person, someone that they can actually, you know, as I said, feels like they've got their back. Yeah, that's so important. So it's a question to ask of schools: who is our child connected to? You know, in this school, and who advocates for them when things, you know, do get sticky. You know, I had a little young fellow who was diagnosed with ADHD, and his classroom teacher shifted their programming so that every day the whole class started outside doing a very physical activity, you know, for 20 minutes. And that actually made a huge difference, you know, to how that young person then was able to engage in learning. So you know, not all of the ideas are kind of highly complicated, or do you know what I mean? And really often it is sitting in the room with all the right people and throwing out ideas and saying, well, what about if we try this, you know? And then coming back to it. Now, if that didn't work, that's okay, because these problems are complex. We're not always going to get the solution first time round, or what we come up with may take some perseverance and some time, you know.
Staying the course.
Well, you got to stay the course, absolutely. Yeah. And we do have to look at where young people are developmentally, you know, to make sure that that what we're asking them to do, that they do experience some success with. Because a lot of our young people become very risk averse, you know, and because they don't want to look silly, you know, or
failure averse.
Failure averse. They don't want to, you know, they don't want to fail again. So how are we setting our kids up, you know, for success? Which means that when we're having these conversations with school about our young person's behaviour, let's also talk about where are they developmentally, and where are they learning wise and literacy wise, and are we actually working on that as well? Because, you know, we've got to be doing both. You know, we can't just only ever focus on behaviour. You know, we have to be focusing on both, otherwise we're doing the kids a really huge disservice, and the behaviours of inattention and mucking up, and those things are exacerbated by not being able to access the curriculum.
Exactly. And if we give kids the skills to access the curriculum, there will be a reduction in problem behaviours. It's like night follows day. You've got to stay the course, and you need a team of teachers who are responding consistently in that way, and really prioritising learning, not just engagement, but learning, and making sure that we close the gap for these students, because they go to school to learn to read. You don't go to prison to learn to read. That's not where we want anyone in our society to be learning to read.
And it's both and, isn't it? It is both engagement and learning. It's
Absolutely.
not either or.
Not either or, but we can't over-invest in the engagement
Yep.
basket and hope that that's going to fix everything.
Yep. Great.
Okay. You've got about a minute, Pam, to give us your final...
magical magic bullets. Well, look, this is a multi-system issue, obviously. I think we could collectively do more to support schools and support teachers to I guess, another metaphor that I often use, and you probably do too, is the idea of building better fences at the top of the cliff, rather than parking lots of ambulances down at the bottom of the cliff. Now, we need ambulances at the bottom of the cliff because there will always be young people who, for whatever reason, fall and need to be supported down the track. But it makes every kind of compassionate, economic, logical sense to build better fences at the top of the cliff. And, for me, that would look like having high quality, rigorous early reading instruction, low variance delivery of early reading instruction. Unfortunately, at the moment, we've got a picture of high variance in the way that reading is approached in schools. Now, that's particularly problematic for this group of children, because they need the best rigour that they can get access to. They don't need to be going into a lottery when they start school with respect to the kinds of reading instruction that they're going to be exposed to. But B, they often change schools more often than other children. Much more. So they're going to be experiencing, a bit of this and a bit of that and a bit of something else. So there's no coherence in what they're exposed to. So for me, that's the, relatively speaking, low-hanging fruit. And we should be all putting our shoulders to the wheel and making that a 10-year plan. It won't cure cancer, but we would see some benefits, I believe, if we got that right.
Well spoken. Thank you very much. To Michelle and Pam, thank you so much for the opportunity to have this conversation. As always, incredibly insightful. I'll ask a public request, and we might do it again next year if that's all right. And we'll keep talking about how we can. Excellent. We'll keep talking about how we can, really put some fences at the top of the cliff. Yeah.
Yep.
And to everyone, thank you very much for your time today. And remember, hook into books. We read, we read, we read. Thanks, Pam. Thanks, Michelle. Take care.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.